Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We're going to hang out for just a few more minutes. Looks like we have a pretty good crowd tonight, and we're going to give folks a few more minutes to join on, and we will get the program started shortly. All right. Thank you, everyone, again for joining us tonight. My name is Candace Lopez. I am the Chief Philanthropy Officer with Horizons Foundation. As you know, Horizons Foundation is an LGBTQ foundation by and for queer people. And we're really happy that you have joined us tonight. We have a pretty remarkable lineup of individuals who are doing some incredible work in the community, and we're just excited to hear what they have to share with us. It is timely as well, as there is a lot happening in the world. So before we get started, and I will go ahead and go through a few housekeeping things. You are all muted and your video is off, so we can't see you, even though you can see us. So, if you have to eat dinner or brush your teeth or something, no one's going to see you. You'll be just fine. There is cart captioning available. So if you look at the bottom of your screen to your right, you can turn on the closed caption so that you can have captioning services. We will be you can use the chat function for Q&A. So this won't be something for everyone to see, but if you did want to send in a question to the panelist or our moderator, you're welcome to do that. In terms of viewing, making this an experience for you that is most convenient, you can use the top right icon that says view, and you can toggle back and forth between speaker view or gallery view, just whatever is comfortable for you if you're new to Zoom. With that being said, I think we're ready to get started. So I'm going to go ahead and kick it off to Roger Doughty, who is our President and CEO of Horizons Foundation.
Well, thank you, Candace. It's wonderful to be here with all of you. Thank you all for joining us here tonight. As Candace said, for those who might be less familiar with Horizons, Horizons has been around for 41 years. And last year we made something over $5 million in grants. And we also sponsor programs to support donors, to build our LGBTQ organizations, and also to build resources for future generations of LGBTQ people. Before we get underway, today is December 1st, and that, as we all know, is World AIDS Day. And I would just like to ask that we just take a short moment, all in silence, to reflect on this day and those whom we have lost and we've loved. So thank you for taking a few moments. Thank you. So when we look at the history of our movement, it's one thing that can be said about it has always been just nonstop, whether it's in state houses or courthouses or in the streets or wherever it is, our movement has been one thing after another. And 2021 has been no different from that. We've got a new administration in Washington. We've got a new Supreme Court, which, as you all know, just heard some very important arguments earlier today. We've got the ongoing and urgent community reckoning around racial justice, the ongoing pandemic, refugee crises, a record number of murders of transgender people, especially Black trans women. And we continue to live in times when, for many of us, our rights aren't secure, And we don't even have access to some of the basic necessities of life, food and housing, access to healthcare. And of course, that burden falls most on those with the least access, including transgender folks and people of color in our community. And our charge, our community's challenge, our collective challenge, our movement's challenge is still as vital and as necessary as ever. So in short, we live in historic times. And judging from the 65 plus questions that those of you attending submitted, there's a lot on all of your minds as well. And I promise we'll get to as many of those as we can. Now, tonight's event is part of a long tradition at Horizons. This is, I think, the 16th or 17th year of the State of the Movement event. And it's always a privilege for Horizons to offer this opportunity for all of us, even if just for a few months, to step back from the daily tumult and to spend some time with and hear from some of the really outstanding leaders in our movement. And before I introduce tonight, I just want to give you a quick preview of what the evening will look like. So we're going to start out with my asking a question to all of the panelists, and then I'll move on to asking some questions directly of panelists. Then there'll be a short section of kind of just questions posed to all the panelists at once, and then we'll turn to Q&A, and I promise there'll be a substantial portion for the Q&A, and that will be a combination of questions that you might submit through the Q&A function on the webinar and all of the ones that we got submitted before. And I also just want to note that the questions submitted have also helped to shape some of the questions that I'll be asking panelists directly. So thank you all for taking the time to give us that input. So now, one of my favorite moments is I get to introduce this group of incredible people. So just going in alphabetical order, Kevin Jennings, who is the CEO of Lambda Legal, Kierra Johnson, who's the Executive Director of the National LGBTQ Task Force, Andy Marra, the Executive Director of the Transgender Legal Defense and Education Fund, and Maria Sjödin, who is the Interim Executive Director of Outright Action International. Thank you all so much for being with us tonight. You have some of the busiest schedules of any people in the movement, and it means a lot that you've taken the time to join us. So thank you. So I'd like to start out now with a question that's about something that has affected pretty much everyone and everything in the past year and a half, going on 2 years, and that's the pandemic. And in the last year, last few days, we all know there's been even new, potentially worrisome news about the pandemic. So reflecting on this time, which has just changed everything, could each of you maybe talk about, particularly in the last year, one new challenge that the pandemic has brought to our movement? And also, if hopefully you can think of one, is there an opportunity that the pandemic has opened up that might not have existed for us before that? And I'm going to continue going in alphabetical order here. And so, Kevin, I'm going to turn to you first.
First of all, thank you, Roger. And let me begin by saluting you and the entire Horizons team, both board and staff and donors. What you've created with the Horizons Foundation is truly remarkable. So thank you. It's an honor to be part of this. It's an honor to join Kierra, Maria, and Andy, all of whom are good friends and wonderful colleagues. And it's especially poignant to me that you should have begun with the moment of silence on World AIDS Day. I put a meme on my social media today. No one in San Francisco needs to be reminded of this, but the devastation that AIDS has wrought on our community. In New York, where I live, twice as many people have died of AIDS as Americans who died in the Vietnam War. So it's been an absolute decimation of our community, in particular my generation of gay men. And I'm very grateful that you acknowledged that to begin the program. Well, I think that in terms of an opportunity the pandemic has brought us, let's start with the positive. I actually think that the advent, although I'm sure many of us would prefer to never have another one, of the Zoom meeting has actually been a great equalizer in our community. Our community tends to, our national organizations in particular, tends to favor events in cities like San Francisco or New York. And those events sometimes are very pricey for people to attend. What's happened thanks to Zoom is that people who live in rural areas, like I grew up in rural North Carolina, or who don't have the same level of resources have had access to events like this and access to people that maybe they didn't have previously. So I know I have found that Lambda Legal, a lot of people have actually been able to participate in stuff that we've offered that were not physically or financially able to participate in the past, thanks to the leveling effect of Zoom. So even though I think we all have a lot of Zoom fatigue, I think there's actually something to be said for rethinking of how we make ourselves available to our community through new technologies that is broadening access, that I think is actually a very good thing. That is very much an unintended and unexpected side effect of the pandemic. I think one thing that the pandemic has complicated for everyone is we are a very high touch community. People do like to see each other. Our events create community for people. They create opportunities to interact, and the curtailment of that over the last year and a half has, I think, has been especially hard in our community. I want to speak as a former teacher myself, especially hard for LGBTQ youth, many of whom have been deprived of access to community resources, have been forced to be at home with families that in many cases are not very accepting. We know from the Trevor Project that calls are up, suicide rates are up, that it's been a particularly hard time for LGBTQ youth during the pandemic because for them, home is not necessarily a safe place, and many of them have been forced to be in homes that are not safe for them. So definitely the pandemic has had many deleterious effects, but as a former teacher, I think of it from the perspective of LGBTQ youth, for whom the pandemic, I think, has been especially problematic and difficult.
Thank you, Kevin. And continuing with the Ks, Kierra.
Thank you so much. And I am also super excited and honored to be here with you all. I can't wait till we can do this in a room together again. Well, it'll be my first time if I get invited back, but I'm saying I know you all do it together. I agree with you, Kevin. There's something to be said about how creative we've had to be, right, over the last 2 years to find ways to connect, right, with our people and the work. I also think this has been, these last couple of years it's been an opportunity to rethink, re-envision, restructure, experiment. In a lot of ways, people have asked me, like, how has it been coming into leadership in the middle of COVID? And I'm like, it's as weird as you would think it is. And in a lot of ways, COVID has created this context where nobody knows what they're doing. So it's like I'm in good company because we're all trying to figure it out as we go, not just as a new leader, but because we're living in a new norm, right? And our reality is changing every couple of weeks at this point, right? So, for any of us who have strategic plans, it's pretty much you throw it out and start over 3 weeks from now, and then you start over again 3 weeks from now. I think this time has also allowed for new types of leaders to emerge, right? For a long time, I think vulnerability was like the kryptonite for CEOs and executives. And right now, I think, at least in my experience, the vulnerability is needed and wanted, and in many ways, not always, valued. And what I mean by that is, I am really clear and explicit that I'm going to lead with my humanity, and that I'm not afraid to say I don't know, right? Like, I just don't know the answer. I tell the staff on a regular basis, like, we have to be willing to fail. We're going to anyway, so let's embrace it and figure out how are we going to learn from those things? We need to experiment, right? Which means we're going to get things wrong. And there's real vulnerability in telling people you don't have to be perfect. We don't have to live up to what we thought, was our best 3 years ago, right? That's not our best now. And so I do think it's allowed for us to evolve, right, in our leadership. I do think that's also a real challenge, right? Like, leading, this is now my second time as an executive director, and I've never experienced leading it like in any way, in like the context we're in right now. And we're charged to evolve and evolve quickly, right? Evolve what we thought we knew, what we thought was right, what we thought was productive, what we thought was, and so we're having to assess our leadership, but then also figure out what of our leadership we are willing and able to evolve to meet the times.
Thank you. Thank you. And yes, it's kind of like compelled creativity, but sometimes that's somewhere where the greatest creativity happens. Next, Andy.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for having me tonight. I think just to build off of the theme around creativity, let's start with the good. We've had to, especially for trans folks across the country, trans and non-binary folks, we have had to be creative in making sure that folks that are, especially who are working class, low income, or poor, continue to have access to safety net resources. And what has been, I think, especially at the beginning of COVID, we saw a massive upheaval in our safety net systems. Most of our clients that come to TILDEF are living on less than $12,000 a year, so below the federal poverty line, often are insecure in terms of housing, often are unemployed or are working from job to job. And the fact of the matter is, many of our clients and many folks in our community just simply could not access the safety net services that the rest of the country was also trying to access, with folks who are being furloughed, who are being laid off, who are experiencing unemployment. Many trans people lost income, and we saw that processing unemployment benefits, or any public benefits for that matter, took much longer than I think many had anticipated. And I think it speaks to the crumbling infrastructure that we see in when it comes to safety net providers, particularly at the local and the state levels. For some of our clients, especially who are trying to access what I would describe as survival-based interventions, when we talk about legally changing your name or legally changing your gender marker, that often, at least for name changes, requires a court appearance in some jurisdictions, and courts closed. Like many agencies, like many offices, they just simply shut down. For a trans person, to be able to legally change your name is often the first step to being able to access public benefits, being able to go to a doctor's office and be recognized as their true and authentic self. And because the courts closed, many of our clients were held in limbo and couldn't access safety net services in a safe and accessible manner. So for us, TILDEF, we had to completely pivot, like many of our partners did at the early onset of COVID. And for us, we had to engage in behind the scenes court advocacy. We had to talk to judges, we had to talk to court staff and say, look, you need to consider coming into the era of Zoom and start adopting Zoom meetings to continue court appearances, or to continue at least processing name changes without a court requirement. And in the state of New Jersey, they actually removed some of the barriers to legally changing your name because of some of the advocacy that we did, among other sites that we're currently active in. I think the other promising sign, and certainly with at the time when the Biden administration was really getting their feet wet, what we saw was an outpouring of support from the administration. They reached out to us at TILDEF and many of our partner organizations, I'm sure Lambda Legal and the task force as well, to actually have a really robust and honest conversation about what does equitable vaccine access look like for queer and trans communities. And for us as a trans-led and trans-run organization, gave us a really powerful and I think transformative opportunity for us to be able to say, like, look, these are some of the inequities that we see across the country, and here are some opportunities for the administration as well as your partners across states at state-based agencies to play a meaningful role in making sure that vulnerable populations like trans folks of color are guaranteed access to the vaccine. We know that, again, folks are vulnerable and susceptible. So.
Thank you. And actually, we're gonna circle back to some of what you said just in a few minutes. But first, I'd like to turn to you, Maria, bringing, of course, the international perspective, a global movement as well.
Thank you so much, Roger, and thank you so much for having me here today. I mean, I think if anyone needs proof why we need to think globally, a pandemic, unfortunately, is the perfect illustration to that. And so you asked about the challenges, and I think that when we what we saw at the beginning of the pandemic and throughout the pandemic is how hard hit our communities were globally. Andy already touched on some of the things, but loss of income immediately, the impossibility of being able to go back to your original family. You might not be welcome there, or if you go there, you're forced to live under their rules. I think that the opportunity that we saw was that we launched a global COVID emergency fund that to date has distributed over $3 million to organizations in over 100 countries. And I have to say, I knew Outright was a nimble organization, but I have to say I was surprised by how successful we were. And it really wouldn't have been possible without a lot of individuals, foundations, and corporations stepping up, including Horizons Foundation and several of the people attending this event. So a big thank you for making that possible. Of course, $3 million globally is still a drop in the bucket. And so what we're seeing sort of as an opportunity, and also really as a responsibility, is to take the lessons learned into a project about queering humanitarianism and influencing governments to make them realize that when you have a pandemic that hits everyone, marginalized communities fare even worse. And you can't assume that whatever you do as a government is just automatically going to reach everyone. If you distribute your aid at police stations like they did in Sri Lanka, living in a country that criminalizes your identity means you're not going to go there. Or if you try to access support that's intended for families, and they tell you, well, two women, that's not a family, you don't qualify. So I think taking it forward into that advocacy, I see it as an opportunity, but I know, of course, it's also going to be hard.
Whoops, sorry, just realized that I was muted. So thank you all for sharing your thoughts about that. And I'd like to turn now to going back a little bit to something that Andy, you in particular touched on with respect to the coming of a new administration. And so, clearly the administration laid out the kind of welcome mat that we hadn't seen for a number of years, I think it would be safe to say. And so, but if you could share a little bit more, because I want to ask this question of you, Andy, and then turn to Kierra as well. If you could describe maybe just like one or two of the ways that people might not see on a day-to-day basis where that change has happened, and what is different, and what opportunities there may be. Again, things that might not be in the papers that folks would see anyway. Andy?
Yeah, so I think what really sticks out in terms of the contrast between the former administration that we will not name and the current administration is that immediately after the elections, we heard from Biden's transition team. They reached out to us proactively, and they were already in the process of scheduling meetings with us to talk about initial priorities for the incoming administration. As a result of that, TILDEFs and all of our attorneys have met with the vast majority of the federal agencies that really touch trans and non-binary people across the country: HHS, housing and urban development, veterans affairs, and the like. And I have to say that, the queer and trans community had a really strong ally in the Obama administration, but I have to say that the Biden administration has felt a little bit more, even more robust in their outreach to the community and making sure that many of our organizations have a seat at the table in terms of influencing policy that the administration pursues. I think the second example, and a good example to what I was just referring to, was, over the summer, the administration kicked off what they called their interagency working group, focused exclusively on trans folks of color, and making sure that the interests of trans folks of color are, and their lived experiences are reflected in federal priorities for the administration. I myself traveled down to DC to meet with senior White House staffers, including Susan Rice, who's the head of the U.S. Domestic Policy Council, and Julissa Reynoso, who is the head of the Gender Policy Council. And we laid out our till death priorities for the administration as it pertains to trans and non-binary people, inclusive of making sure to streamline and remove barriers to name changes and gender markers for federal identification, like passports, making sure that there's a third gender marker option available to folks, making sure that gender affirming care is guaranteed in insurance coverage, particularly for the federal employee healthcare benefits program. The federal government is one of the largest employers in this country. Many of their healthcare plans actually include exclusions that impact trans people from being able to access care. So we were very clear in addressing those particular barriers for trans federal employees. And data collection, which may sound a little wonky, but if the feds aren't tracking our community, we don't have a seat at the table, we can't access financial resources, and we can't make sure that federal services or federally funded services meet the needs of our community. And I have to say, it's pretty timely. In observance of the Trans Day of Remembrance, the administration laid out a report from the interagency working group detailing these listening sessions that they carried out after our meeting, the inaugural meeting that I was part of, with dozens of community activists across the country. And sure enough, the administration has been taking some very positive steps to remove barriers to name changes, to making sure that gender affirming care is recognized as an essential health benefit in this country, and making sure that our lived experiences and our identities are actually being tracked by the government to inform federal funding. So we have seen some really exciting progress in DC, and I'm really encouraged by the initial steps that the Biden administration has taken.
Well, thank you. And Kierra, I know that the task force being based in DC and also working all across the country, but I was wondering if there was anything that you wanted to add, being so close to that particular action as you are.
I mean, really, I think Andy summed it right on up, much more succinctly than I ever could. And I'm a talky one. But what I will say is that it is clear that the administration is not interested in staying at a surface level as it relates to building, creating policies, building in interventions that can really improve the quality of life for LGBTQ plus people, right? So it's clear to me that the administration isn't waiting for us to contact them. They are actively reaching out into the community. They are asking deep, complex questions, and it's across the board, right? Like, so it's yes, we're being engaged on conversations about the effects of HIV and AIDS, and where do we need to go, who's being left behind, how do we go deeper? But they're also asking questions about K-12 education. How do we do better K-12 education for queer, questioning, trans young people, right? They're really getting in, I think, into the the practical everyday changes, and really are hungry to know the lived experiences, and then want to be partners. They really want to be partners in thinking with us, and coming up with interventions, throughout the administration. I will also say that representation matters, right? And we've seen, right, folks have heard it, probably a million times about how diverse, right, the Biden administration is, and how there are the most, right, out LGBTQ plus folks in this administration. And the representation matters, but it is also like our people have access to decision makers, right? Thought leaders, people in power, right? So our community is a closely knit one. Our ecosystem is very, very tightly connected. And so it puts so many more of us who are living on the front lines in direct communication and in direct connection with people who actually have power to make change. I was at the White House today for World AIDS Day, and there were some HIV/AIDS activists that were like in tears. These queer, brown folk who've been doing this work for decades were like, wow, like it feels so weird that we're wanted here. Like, can you believe that we're here? And what that means for the community, to not feel like we're being, to not be targeted on the news, right, on TV, through pieces of legislation on a daily basis, but to really feel like you can be seen in your wholeness and engaged in a way that is meaningful and powerful.
Okay, well, thank you, and all of those things are really hugely encouraging, and thank you for letting us look a little bit behind some of the headline things. So I want to turn now actually to another topic, and Kevin, I'm going to turn to you, and both because of your work at Lambda, you also have a background as an educator. And across the country, we're seeing schools once again become battlegrounds. And whether it's these wild school board meetings or books being kept out of libraries or all of the above, schools, kids, education, they've always been deeply felt issues for so many. And as usual, queer folks and queer kids are right in the thick of a lot of it. So Kevin, what is it that you think that we're seeing now? Like, what is going on, and how is that impacting or may impact LGBTQ youth in particular?
Great question. And I think that we need to put this within historical context, which is that one of the most effective ways of demonizing a marginalized group in a society is to say they're after your kids. Jews supposedly drank the blood of Christian children in the Passover Seders. That was used to justify pogroms. Black men were supposedly after white girls. That was used to justify lynching. LGBT people supposedly recruit. That was used to justify the Briggs Initiative here in California back in 1978, which would have banned the employment of out teachers. So the right wing is falling back on a very effective, very tired trope, which is to say that marginalized groups, specifically Black and LGBTQ people, are after your kids through critical race theory and through gender propaganda. In fact, Maria can speak to this better than I can. There will be a ballot initiative in Hungary next year, which will speak specifically to the supposed proliferation of gender propaganda in Hungarian schools and will criminalize that if passed in popular referendum. So we've seen this before. Our community has had to fight this before. Our community will have to fight this again. And I think that it's an example of our opponents and how cynical they are. They're willing to use children as political footballs, particularly trans children, who they are trying to ban from participating in school sports. They're trying to prevent from receiving gender-affirming care. And to quote Barney Frank, the concern of Republicans begins at conception and ends at birth, which we learned today at the Supreme Court. There's no genuine interest in the welfare of trans children, for example. They pose themselves as supposedly being defenders of children. They're actually people who take already marginal and vulnerable children and make them more marginal and more vulnerable. all for political expediency. It's despicable. And we have seen it before. Let's remember, we defeated the Briggs Initiative here in California in 1978, and we will beat these people again.
Thank you. Thank you for helping to put that all in such a long historical context. Maria, I want to turn to the international sphere now for a moment. When Afghanistan fell to the Taliban, we all saw these horrifying accounts of thousands and thousands of people trying to flee the country, including lots and lots of LGBTQ people. And that's not the only place, of course, that we've seen LGBTQI refugees. There have been many other places as well, and there likely will be in the future too. Are we seeing now an increase in the forced migration of LGBTQI people? And whether it's an increase or just a continuing stream, are there things that we can be doing about it that just aren't being done now?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I mean, I think we were all kind of moved by what we saw, and I think I want to put it in a little bit of a context. I mean, LGBTIQ people are often targets by states, including the ones who want to assert whatever brand of nationalism or conservatism that they promote. And of course, people who break norms around gender and sexuality are very often a target. And that is very clear, I think, in the case of the Taliban, who, as we all know, are very focused on policing gender norms. And so, of course, it means that many people want to try to leave. And I think the biggest challenge is, I mean, first of all, Afghanistan has 38 million people. So it means that, if we're talking, I don't know what sort of exact percentage we want to use here, but we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people or millions that could somehow fit, I think, within the LGBTIQ umbrella, broadly speaking. And of course, most of those people are never in a position to leave. And the ones who are in a position to leave, unfortunately, in too many places, are not really welcome anywhere. I mean, we see increasingly, I think, this anti-immigrant rhetoric. We have definitely seen it, I think, quite a lot in the US, but we see it around the world. I'm originally from Sweden. I follow a lot of European media. I often talk about Europe as Fort Europe, like whatever they can do to keep people out, that's what they want to do. And it sometimes feels like when politicians talk about the crisis in Afghanistan, what they really mean is the crisis of refugees that they don't want to welcome to Europe. So I think that's on us as a movement to keep the pressure on our governments, and our governments have to let people in, and they have to let people leave in a safe way. So I think that's something that we absolutely have to do. And I think, unfortunately, I don't have a good solution to that. I think it's one of the hardest problems that we see. And I mean, there are many people there are 68 countries today that criminalize same-sex relations. And of course, many more where people are persecuted and discriminated. So the long-term solution obviously cannot be for everyone to sort of leave. We have to create space for people to live in their home countries in a safe way. And that's why we need really to have a global movement. But at the same time, when people have to leave and seek asylum, we have to ensure that governments are stepping up and protecting people, including LGBTIQ people.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Really appreciate that additional perspective. I want to go back to the domestic realm and want to put this question to you again, Kierra, because even as it's a relief for us to have more friendly, welcoming, administration in the White House, a lot of the action, as it always has, is taking place at the state level, state by state by state, and we've been facing onslaughts of not just legislation, but other movements at the state level. And I know that the task force for many years has worked in states around the country and has a really close ear to the ground. Could you talk a little bit about what you think we are seeing And are there tactics or strategies that maybe we haven't yet employed to try to at least diminish the number of these attacks, which keep us on our back heels, if even when we're victorious in a certain one fight or another?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. The short answer to that is yes. I think we're going to continue to see it. There's been, while we definitely had some wins, it is definitely keeping people distracted on like you're constantly in a state of reaction, in defense, and we're seeing it, state legislation that hurts trans kids. We're seeing voting rights being rolled back. We're seeing access to abortion being diminished, and so I think we're going to keep seeing it, and I also think so. If you're feeling glass half full today, people are saying, this is what happens when our movements are successful, You see an uptick, in the opposition, they're feeling desperate, maybe that's the case. Either way, the reality is that we can't win if we are attempting to address these different attacks in silos, in siloed movements, in siloed organizations. There are states, like Texas, for example, where there are attacks on voting rights, trans kids, and immigrant rights too, and abortion, happening all at the same time. If there's any time for us to really practice leaning into intersectional coalition building, movement building, figuring out how we resource each other on the ground, so on the streets, but also in the halls of state legislatures, we're going to tire ourselves out, and it's. I think we've got a lot of alignment there, I think the other thing that we're up against is that people are tired, We had 4 years of the previous administration, and then we went into a pandemic, and so we have to be mindful, of it's going to take an additional or new ways of organizing, creative ways of engagement, and consistently be able to do that to bring people back, I think, into the fight and be able to do it in a different way.
Thank you. Thank you for those insights here. I want to turn back now. Speaking of state level nightmares, I feel like we've got to talk about, or at least touch on, Texas SB 8, which was just heard before the Supreme Court. And of course, today, as we've alluded to, arguments in the Dobbs case, which are directly about reproductive justice, will also have very clear and potentially profound implications for LGBTQ rights and a host of other areas as well. Kevin, what do you expect that we are going to see from this court? And I know millions of people are asking this question. Nobody has the answer, but from your perspective at Lambda, what do you see, and what are the potential implications and strategies to try to deal with the fact that?
Well, I keep reverting to I keep reverting to the U.S. history teacher that I once was, and I need to remind people the American government system has 3 branches: executive, legislative, and judicial. As Andy and Kierra have noted, it is a new day at the executive level. And as an Obama appointee, I want to say Andy is absolutely right that the Biden administration has taken it to a whole new level. So that's a green light. The legislative branch, well, depending on Kyrsten Sinema or Joe Manchin's mood that day, can be a green light. We're hopeful to get the Equality Act, but that remains in question. The judiciary is a red light. 1/3 of the Supreme Court and over 1/3 of all federal judges were appointed by Donald Trump. Lambda Legal has studied their records. They have documented records of hostility towards LGBTQ rights, reproductive rights, racial justice, voting rights. You can keep going down the list. And let's be really clear, virtually all the major advances that have come for this movement have come through litigation, not legislation. Marriage equality, the repeal of sodomy laws, employment non-discrimination protections. These were all things we won at the Supreme Court. And the bad news about that is that can all be taken away. And a lot of people are telling me, oh, the country has changed, attitudes are different, that can never happen, Kevin. Let me repeat a second history lesson. In the 1860s and 70s, during Reconstruction, there was the enfranchisement of Black people, there were Black senators, there were Black governors, there were Black congresspeople, and then the Supreme Court began chipping away at those rights, culminating in Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, in which they legalized segregation and the disenfranchisement of Black people, and all of the gains that supposedly were made for Black people in the 1860s and 70s were rolled back for a half a century. Anyone who thinks that can't happen to the LGBTQ community is in denial. We have got to double down on the work we're doing in the judicial system, because just as we made our progress through the judicial system, we can see that progress rolled back. And I thought today, I got to comment on one thing. I don't know how many people watched the arguments today. It was particularly cynical of conservative justices to basically try to justify the overturning of Roe versus Wade using Lawrence versus Texas and Obergefell as examples. Those same justices would have voted against Lawrence versus Texas and then against Obergefell. In some cases, they did. So for them to claim our landmark victories as some kind of weird justification to overturn a woman's right to choose is just appalling and disgusting, and shows exactly how cynical they are.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. I want to turn back to you, Andy, for a moment, and I just want to note for the all of you who are tuned in that the Q&A is only visible to the hosts and the panelists by design, and we've been being trolled, this evening, especially around some really horrible anti-trans messages, which of course we're dealing with. But it just brings right into the present moment some of the hate and the challenges that we are all dealing with. And so, Andy, I wanted to ask you also, and you've mentioned a number of these already, but are there any particular issues that are impacting the transgender community that you see that haven't been mentioned yet, and or are ones that you think that our movement as a whole needs to pay greater attention to than we are now?
Yeah, I think that it's important, and this was already shared earlier, it's important to name the fact that this year has been groundbreaking. It has been groundbreaking in a number of ways, related to the pandemic, related to some of the, I think, achievements that our movement has been able to make, but it's also been groundbreaking in the fact that this was a record-breaking year in terms of the number of anti-trans deaths. We're up to close to 50 in this country alone, and almost all of them are Black and brown trans women. It was also groundbreaking in the sense that we saw almost 160 anti-trans bills be introduced in state legislatures across the country, seeking either to criminalize gender-affirming care, essentially allowing lawmakers to dictate what is medically necessary instead of a doctor or a licensed health provider, and also to criminalize the participation of trans and non-binary young people from participating in sports. And just to be clear, many LGBTQ plus students, whether you're trans, whether you're bisexual, whether you're gay, or questioning your identity, many of folks already avoid extracurricular activities in sports. So just to name and uplift the trope that is being used to drum up support against our community, to use trans young people, to use trans lives as a wedge issue, is not only despicable, but it is also being manufactured by our opponents. So when we talk about all of these record number of bills, when we talk about the rhetoric that we've seen emerge in states and in local communities across the country about trans folks, this has all been orchestrated by the top 5 anti-LGBTQ plus organizations in this country. We're talking about the Heritage Foundation, we're talking about the Alliance Defending Freedom, we're talking about Concerned Women for America. And what I think is particularly important to note about these organizations, for many of us who've been working in the movement for years, if not decades, these same folks have been intentionally building up to this moment. And I think there are 2 points that I would just lift up to describe or articulate why this has been an intentional and coordinated effort. One, for the Heritage Foundation and other organizations, they have been actively recruiting what I would describe as radical feminists, folks that identify as being feminists and have been using them as high-level spokespeople to create a wedge between trans issues and feminist issues. And for me, just to be clear, as someone who is deeply intersectional in terms of my politic, there isn't a distinction. Gender justice is a trans issue, it is a women's issue, it is a repro issue, it is a racial justice issue. And when you see the very folks that opposed marriage equality, that have opposed a woman's right to choose or a person's right to choose to have an abortion, are the same folks that are whipping up support amongst individuals and using them to create wedges in public conversations. That should be a red flag. And the second point that I would make is that many of the bills that we saw pop up across the country, not just this year, but in prior years, and I would suspect next year too, as we enter another state legislative season, is that many of these bills are simply model bills that were drawn up by many of the organizations that I've named. Many of the state lawmakers do not have trans constituents or have not met with concerned parents or concerned community members that would have resulted in the kind of legislation that we saw pop up this past year. So I would say to the folks that have questions about where all of this hatred, where all of this fear mongering is coming from, it's coming from the very same people that have opposed voting rights. It is coming from the very same people that have opposed marriage equality. It is coming from the very same people that have fought so hard against dismantling Roe v. Wade. And so I would just, to get off my soapbox for a minute, as someone who is a solution-based person, what's really critical for our movement and community is to center the experiences of trans people. Listen. Especially our youngest in our community. We have trans and non-binary children, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 years old, that have had to go to state legislatures and speak their truth. I don't know about you, but when I was 8 or 9 or 10, I wasn't doing that, and nor should they have to. But in the instances of what I anticipate will be another challenging state legislative season in 2022, pay attention and center the voices of trans young people and the parents of those trans young people who are simply fighting to exist.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you for sharing that and the passion and feeling behind it. Just one last question for this part of our program, and then I'm going to just segue quickly towards the Q&A portion. Because I do have an eye on the clock as well. But Maria, I wanted to go back to the international sphere for a moment. And one of the areas in which Horizons Foundation's Global Faith and Equality Fund has been funding significantly is to try to counter this potent narrative that is out there in the world that was so-called gender ideology. In a thumbnail way, what is gender ideology? And how is the narrative around it impacting LGBTQI people, and what can be done to counter it?
So I think this is directly linked to what Andy just spoke about.
Yeah.
So the idea of gender ideology is basically the claim that feminist and LGBTIQ movements are out to subvert traditional families and social values, and that is a bad thing. It's really a conspiracy theory because we know that giving rights to people does not take rights away from others. If we have marriage equality, it doesn't mean that people who identify as men and women can't marry each other anymore. There are so many examples of this. But this is really an idea that is being pushed, and we see it has really become a global problem. And the idea that they claim that all the things that we stand for is an ideology allows them to, for example, if we go to the many so-called LGBT-free zones in Poland, you can, when they are being questioned about that, they will say, oh, we're not after the people, we're after the ideology. But really, I'm not an ideology. I am a person. And if you're telling me as a non-binary lesbian that I'm not welcome, I'm going to take it personally. And so is everyone else. We're not an ideology, we are people. And this kind of rhetoric, we know it leads to physical attacks on people. We see it in Ghana I'm just picking one example here now. There's a bill in Ghana that's really driven by this anti-gender movement, and it leads to physical attacks on people. Obviously, we've seen it in US politics, including under the previous administration, trying to even erase the word gender from documents being negotiated at the United Nations. And so I think it's incredibly important that we push back against these notions, even though they are well-funded and they are at the moment gaining traction in a lot of parts of the world, but we have to push back. I mean, this idea that we're out, they call it anti-propaganda laws. Many have heard about that from the case of Russia, but we see it in a lot of other places too. And the propaganda that we are supposedly promoting are things like waving a rainbow flag or talking about our own families. But I think that what we can do to counter it, I think, is in part just that, like talking about ourselves, talking about the things that we have in common. And I think it's important to try, and I mean, we're all advocates here, so we know that for the most part, when you're trying to change someone's, when you're trying to change hearts and minds, you can't really go for the hardcore real opponents. You have to go for the more movable middle and talk to them about our families or things that we have in common. Most people, even people who can say like, oh, they're not in favor of LGBTIQ rights, whatever that is, but if you ask them if they think that people should be discriminated, they might agree with you on that that's actually a bad thing. So I think it's when we're trying to fight back, of course, we want to expose what they're doing, but we also have to reach the people in the movable middles and talk to them about the things that we have in common and get them on our side. So we have to do both things. We have to attack the ones that are coming after us, but we also have to really think that maybe we can't change their minds at the moment, but we can change the minds of other people.
Well, thank you. And whether it's on the global front or in the local school, board meeting or in Washington or whatever, obviously there are so many things that require our attention. Thank you all for the leadership that you and your organizations are providing around them. I want to shift now towards, going toward the Q&A part of our time together tonight. And the first question that I want to bring forward, which was actually the first question I was going to ask, kind of as an open group question, as well, but we had a number of questions submitted around the same area. We started tonight talking about the pandemic, which is something that has touched everyone and everything. And I want to bring up something that also touches everyone and everything, and that is the pursuit of racial justice. And I believe that we all know at this point that the pursuit of racial justice needs to be at the forefront of our organizations, the communities, and our movements. And all four of you have deep experiences as leaders, and you have positions that require a very broad view of our movement. How do you see our movement, the LGBTQ movement, embracing, and where are we failing to embrace racial justice as integral to this movement? And also picking up on a couple of the submitted questions, are there specific ways that we ought to be fighting racism and white supremacy in our movement, in our own community, that we're not? I'm not calling on folks.
Well, I'll just jump in and say that let's start with some positivity. I think the moment that we're in right now as a movement is actually very exciting. And I say that because if you look at the leadership in our movement, in just less than 3 years, most of our organizations are headed by folks of color, which has been a remarkable shift in terms of thinking about the intersections of racial justice and queer and trans justice in our movement. I think for years, many folks have been talking about, like, let's have a seat at the table. And guess what? We are in that moment right now. For myself, and this is not meant to toot my own horn, and it's actually quite sad, is that, when I was appointed executive director of TILDEF, I'm the first trans woman of color to lead a national trans organization, let alone a national LGBTQ plus organization in this country. And I have to say, it's been a little bit lonely. It's getting better. And we've seen some incredible leaders also step into leadership. I've witnessed Imani at the National Center for Lesbian Rights step into her role, Kierra at the task force, Fran Hutchins at the Equality Federation. And I think just to wrap up, for me as a trans leader, for me to look at my colleagues, it's so exciting for me to be able to go and speak to an audience and say, the 3 national trans groups in our country, TILDEF, the Transgender Law Center, the National Center for Transgender Equality, they're all headed by trans people of color. So I do think that is just, there are 1 or 2 strong points or signals that we are really living and leading into our values around racial justice and thinking about racial equity and inclusion in this country and in our movement. I think the area for growth for our movement is to think, especially for donors and funders, many of whom I'm sure are attending this panel, is to think about how can donors and funders support and uplift and fuel the kind of intersectional leadership that we now have in our movement. I think there's a number of reports that have been produced around executive leadership in social justice organizations at the intersections of race, gender, and sexual orientation. And there are real systemic barriers and challenges that we face in these roles. And so I think one interesting and exciting area is for donors and funders to think about, how can I leverage my personal and professional resources to support these folks in leadership?
Great, thank you. And thank you for bringing that kind of lens of excitement and looking toward the future to it. Others?
I want to ditto a lot of what Andy just said, because I do think that not that there is an enormous amount of work to be done, there obviously is, but the leadership of our movement has never been this diverse before, the institutional leadership. I think the next generation has an understanding of intersectionality in their bones that I find very exciting. New understandings of gender. As some of you might know, when I was a teacher 33 years ago, I helped create the nation's first gay straight alliance. Those are now universally called gender and sexuality alliances, because young people are rejecting the old binaries that my generation was a part of. So fantastic. And to build off something else Andy said, when I was the executive director of the Arkis Foundation, we created a program called the Arkis Leadership Fellows Program, which was a mentorship and support program that targeted first-time executive directors of LGBTQ organizations who were primarily trans and or people of color, and provided them with the coaching and support they needed to succeed in their jobs. So I would urge, as Andy was, that funders and that donors look for opportunities to build institutional support for this new generation and this new generation of leadership, because I think that it's incumbent that we step up with concrete programs, such as the Pipeline Project, headed by my friend Clarence Patton, which trains and equips middle-level managers of color to be executive directors. So there are some really promising institutional interventions like the Arkis Leadership Fellowship Program, the Pipeline Project program, and we just need more of them, like Andy was saying.
I think what we see, obviously, like we've seen a lot of this movement in the US that also, of course, have an impact internationally. And as an organization that primarily works in areas of the world that are, you know, mostly populated by Black and brown people, racial justice and sort of the intersectional lens, I think it's invaluable. And I mean, we've seen, we work with groups, we live in countries that live with the history of colonialism. So bringing an anti-colonial lens to the work, I think is essential if we're going to be successful in our work to strive for liberation and for equality globally. So those things cannot be separated.
You know, it's so exciting to be coming in at this time. You know, Andy, we do our girl chats, like, look at we're growing. I don't know if y'all, so this is like a cultural thing. Does anyone remember Bebe's kids? I can't see you, so I hope you can remember. We don't die, we multiply. But anyway, so it is really exciting, and I think we have to be careful not to think that, again, representation is enough, right? Like, it is a part of it. It is part and parcel, right? Like our people need to see themselves, right, in leadership, various levels of leadership in different departments within organizations, right? In the streets, in the Capitol, in the White House, EDs, development folks, right? Like IT, right? We need to see a diversity of people and in leadership across our organizations and within organizations. And we've got to really unpack what the assumptions are that we have about, right, folks of color coming into leadership. And it's interesting, right? Like, and I've spoken to many, you know, like women of color across movements, not just in this movement, but there is almost a drumbeat of people either expect me to be the messiah, right, of my people, and everything about my organization is going to change because of, right, my particular racial identity, or people will assume I will operate exactly as my white predecessor did, right? Like the change is the race of the person, but they will operate like leadership always has, right? Neither of those things are necessarily true, right? And so how do we start to unpack the implicit bias that is threaded through, right, our organizations, you know, that are decades and decades old, many of them at this point, right? So it's not just about a change of leadership, right? There's an article, I think it was in the New York Times, and I think the headline was, "A Black woman will not fix your organizational culture," right? So we gotta stop putting that on leaders of color that they are gonna fix all of the things. It's a setup, right? And where do we give leaders, new leaders, leaders of color, trans leaders, the the springboard or the runway, right, to be able to make mistakes and do things differently and it not be judged in a pejorative, negative, comparative way, right, to our white, predecessors. So I've been thinking a lot about that. I mean, and I even think about my own bias, right? Like I've been having these conversations with my own coach where since like True Confessions, I said to her, I think I hold my Black staff to a higher standard, right, than I do with other staff. And I was like, it was like an epiphany to me. And I was like, part of that was like my own upbringing in the movements that I've been in, right? Where like Black folks are like, okay, you got to be better. You got to stay later. You got to produce better. You got to produce faster. You got to work more hours, right? Like you've got to do more to be successful and to even be equated with someone who may be doing less because of their gender, because of their race. And I found myself like, that is, right, that's white supremacist thinking. And yet I found myself, like I had internalized it and found myself perpetuating it in a very specific kind of way, right? But so I'm saying, I think we really have to do some work around that. And to Andy's point, we've got to invest in what it takes to really support leaders of color in particular to lead in the unique, right, ways that they're going to lead in the time.
Yeah. Well, thank you all for all of those points and highlighting the immense changes that are happening and need to happen. The clock is ticking, and so with the other questions that have been submitted that I'm going to share, I'm just going to ask our dear panelists to please keep things concise so that we can try to touch on at least a few of those in the time that we've got. So one of those several questions revolved around community and what is community, and one person wrote it as, how do you define our community these days? A ridiculous thing to ask people to talk concisely about, but it's the kind of thing that a number of people were asking about.
Can you repeat it one more time, Roger?
How do you define what your community is in these times?
I can jump in first. I mean, from the global perspective, LGBTIQ, or whatever combination of letters you want to use, is obviously not universal. There are many identities that go back, centuries or thousands of years in parts of the world. So I think from our perspective, thinking of communities like anyone who sort of feels affinity or wants to participate and be part of that umbrella. And I think I want to specifically here echo maybe what Andy also said before. I think right now it's incredibly important that we stand up and assert that trans and non-binary and gender non-conforming people are part of our movement, because there really is a push from some people, including lesbians, to try to push people out. And that is something that we have to stand against.
I love this question, and I took it like so broad, and part of it is I'm thinking about what it means to build community, right? What it means to build movement, what it is going to take to bridge divides. And like when I think, I don't know if people have played the game My People, right? My People, My People. My people are Trekkies. My people are Southerners, right? My people are Georgians. My people are parents. My people are queer, bisexual, pansexual, evolving every damn day. Like my people are transplants to DC, trying not to be gentrifiers and trying to give back to a city that they love, right? Like, and I think we've got to do real. Like this question gives me so much energy because I think we have to break that open, right? Like, who are our people? Because if we allow ourselves to the ecosystems that we're connected to, right? Like that we have cachet in and relationships with and share love and influence and learn from. There's a lot of power, right, in there too, that I think often that if I think we can get so stuck in a silo, and it can be a constricting silo about who our people are, that I think we actually we diminish our own power, we diminish our own influence, we diminish our own creativity, we diminish our ability to see truly how many opportunities there are. So that's how I would answer that question.
So I want to give air to a couple of others that have come up. I wish there were time for more, but obviously that there is not. One of those is within the LGBTIQ framework, bisexual folks have special needs, specific needs. And how will this movement, I'm quoting from the question, how will this movement address these so that bi people become healthier and safer in LGBTQ surroundings?
Full are my people. Hey y'all. Let's we gotta identify ourselves. I know it's like a double dutch sometimes. We're like, I don't know, what are people gonna say? Oh no, I don't know. What are you gonna say when I tell you the thing? I think we have to continue to be courageous. And I don't mean just being courageous in living our truths, right? And living out loud and out of the closet, right? Like, I think we have to be courageous again in really unpacking, why are we uncomfortable, right? Like where are the points where we're like unsure or unclear or or feel like we have to understand, even if you don't understand. And you know, I think we have to be really intentional about talking about and asking the questions about what are the unique impacts, right? These different policies have, right? What are the specific and unique needs of the community? How do we open that up, and what can we learn, right? Like, it's fascinating. People, like the number of people who asked at the rally today at the Supreme Court, well, how is reproductive justice an LGBTQ issue? I was like, I don't know. There's a gang of us who can get pregnant, like a gang, right? And there's a whole network of, we're connected, we're family, we're friends, we're siblings, we're community. And it's like, it blows people's minds. It's like they say queer people have babies, and you're like, oh my God, we got a lot of work to do. So anyway, I just think we have to do some soul searching and really, dig into what, where is it, where's the bias coming from for us?
Anyone else want to chime in on that?
Not sure if this really answers the question, but I would say two things. One is that, at least in the States, the kind of infrastructure for bi-led organizations has been very limited. So I'm thinking of BiNet, the Bisexual Resource Center. These are organizations that have been around for quite some time, and some of them having just shut their doors because there hasn't been the kind of visibility and support paid to them. And I think it's really sad, because if you look at the demographics of our movement, especially amongst our younger folks in our community and in our movement, more and more young people are shirking many of the identities that I would assume that I and others on this panel and who are in attendance of this panel would identify with, but our younger people do not. We've seen this greater shift to queer identities. We've also we've seen this shift from even folks who don't necessarily identify as bi, but instead as pan. And it speaks to future discussions, and I think real discussions that we as a community and movement need to have about the future of what our movement is going to look like. So we're seeing the shift in leadership at our organizations now in terms of like from a racial equity lens. But when, you know, I think about whenever I'm going to retire, and I would like to retire at some point in my life, that our movement and community are going to look vastly different. And so my main point is that we have to pay attention to communities that have been underrepresented and underserved, especially when our community is evolving and changing.
Great, thank you. So I've got two last questions to slip in here. So, so one, and this came up from a number of people, variations on this. What might be one way that, or two ways that people who are connected, you know, through this call might be able to get involved in making a difference in our movement? You know, from your point of view, that we're going to offer to the folks who are joining us tonight, who want to see places to plug in, and perhaps don't.
I mean, I think there are two immediate answers. One is donate, and the other is volunteer. I think those are two things that people can do. Like, look to what kind of organization interests you the most, because if you're going to volunteer your time, you're going to want to do it for something that you that interests you. And then I also think, from sort of the global perspective, I think also like keep yourselves informed. It's like you don't necessarily get all the news about what's happening in Ghana or Poland or Hungary from your regular news sources. You might have to look a little bit extra to find that information. But I think it is, yeah, like I said, I mean, the pandemic shows you have to think globally. So I really want to encourage people to do that.
Other thoughts to share with people joining us tonight? So here's my last.
I would just say we're walking into an election year. You know, I think it is really critical. And again, right, like this, people are like, well, how voting rights? How is that an LGBTQ issue? Are you kidding me? We've got to invest in, and when I say invest, I mean with dollars, but also our time, right? In the cities and states that we're in engaging, registering people to vote, voter education, educating people about what's at stake, you know, investing in organizations that are doing democracy work, right? And the messengers matter. LGBTQ organizations out in the community talking about why voting matters and what's at stake is powerful. People need to know, and they need to see faces and hear from people who are of their community. And it's critical now more than ever.
So last question for all of you. I'd like to ask you to talk about, and I really appreciate that several of you have said, you know, let's take the positive part first before we get into some of the, you know, the other things. And I kind of want to end on that note too. What is one thing that perhaps you feel hopeful about now that maybe 6 months ago you wouldn't have? Or 12 months ago or whatever. I mean, the time frame is arbitrary. I know there's things.
I think for me, I think I always tend to answer this question the same way. So I maybe I'm just ignoring your time frame here, but the fact that our movement is growing globally, I love that. Like, there are countries that even a couple of years ago, there was not a single organization organizing our communities, and now they are there, and people are demanding visibility under the most horrendous circumstances. And people are organizing and making themselves visible and waving rainbow flags, even when it's dangerous. Like, all of these things give me hope, because that is, for me, how we change the world, is by coming together and organizing and getting things done. That for me is like, that always gives me hope. That's what I always look to.
Thank you, Maria. Others? Come on, let's leave with a little hope here.
what gives me hope, not just hope, but joy, are my young people in my community. And it's weird for me to say that because, side story, I used to be a young person myself. That's actually how I met Kevin all those years ago when I was in high school and co-founding my GSA. But now I can say as a more grown person, the young people in the trans and non-binary community give me hope and joy. And I think about like Stella Keating, who we honored at our recent gala. Stella, for many of you who don't know, is a high school student in Tacoma, Washington. She's a trans young person who testified in front of the US Senate Judiciary Committee, speaking her truth, speaking about her accomplishments, her hopes, her dreams. I'm convinced she is going to run for president one day. And she gives me hope and joy that our community is not just growing, we are becoming a thriving and powerful group of folks in this country. So again, I want to retire one day, and I have the hope that I will because of the many young people like Stella who are showing up, speaking their truth, and doing really freaking exciting things.
Can I ditto Andy? First of all, I get to retire before you, Andy. I remember Andy when she was in high school, and I knew then she would be an amazing leader for our movement. So I'm very glad to see that that has proven to be absolutely true. But I want to talk about a very specific young person who gives me hope, and that's Becky Pepper Jackson. Becky Pepper Jackson is an 11-year-old in West Virginia. She wanted to be on her middle school cross-country team, and she was told no because West Virginia passed one of those hateful laws that bans trans people from participating in school sports. Becky and her mom agreed to go to court with Lambda Legal to attack that horrible ban, and it has been stayed in court. And I recently spoke with Becky and her mom, and the thing that really moved me was, first of all, just how incredible Becky was in her sense of who she was at age 11. How fabulous. I thought back to myself at 11, and then I looked at Becky at 11, and I thought, that's progress. And then secondly, how absolutely fierce her mother was that no one was going to screw with her daughter. And, you know, most parents nowadays are significantly younger than I am. I'm 58. And it's not just a new generation of young people, it's a new generation of parents who are not allowing their children to be treated like this. And that gives me a lot of hope because, you know, if my mother would be 96 if she was still alive. She was of a very different generation, and it was a very long journey for her. And I'm finding these parents now that are in some cases young enough to be my children are simply not tolerating the mistreatment of their children. And their 11-year-old daughters like Becky aren't going to stand for it either. And that gives me enormous hope and joy, just as it does for Andy.
Great. Kierra, do you have a quick thing you want to add here?
I ditto on the littles. They're teaching us if we let them. They're showing us the ways. They're showing us agility. They're showing us creativity. They're showing us grace under fire. And I agree. And I would say the other thing is just being able to come in human contact with people again, little by little, brings me joy and a lot of hope. Like, it is just magic to see when people actually, you almost see like their hormones touch each other, and a magic that happens, you know, after being away from each other so long. And so I'm hopeful about being able to do more of that and what's possible when we can do more of that.
Well, thank you all. And I'll tell you, one of the things that gives me hope is people like you. That our movement is graced with leaders who bring the extraordinary dedication and skills and visions that all of you do. And thank you. Thank you so much for joining us. And two other things that give me hope are our incredible nonprofit organizations, our LGBTQ nonprofit organizations, who every single day, just like your organization, are out there in the world, in the streets, in the courthouses, in the state houses, doing the work that needs to be done. And another group that gives me hope are those who donate to these organizations, because we all know that these organizations simply would not be able to operate without that kind of support. And I know a number of the folks who have tuned into this are donors to multiple queer organizations, and I just want to say that you give me hope as well. So I want to give a final thank you to Horizon's terrific team, which behind the scenes has made all of this happen. Thank you. To our phenomenal panelists, and then to all of you who have joined us tonight. Thank you for being here with us. We're going to share a slide with organizations' websites in a moment, and want to wish all of you healthy, warm, and glad holidays, however you choose to celebrate them or not celebrate them. Wishing you all the very best. Thank you and good night.